The text came through at 11:47 that night, 4 hours after I'd become Mrs. Caroline Whitfield, while my new husband slept beside me with his tie still loosely knotted around his neck, and it contained exactly 9 words that would end up rearranging everything I thought I understood about the day we'd just spent 18 months and $40,000 planning. It wasn't from a stranger. It wasn't from a wrong number, or a drunk friend, or anyone I could easily dismiss as irrelevant to the marriage I just entered. It was from Vanessa Cole, the woman my husband had described to me, more than once, as simply someone from a long time ago, and it read, glowing on his phone screen while I lay 2 feet away pretending to be asleep, that dance meant more than you'll ever admit to her. I'm glad I came. I stared at that sentence for what felt like several minutes, feeling something shift permanently in my chest, cold and quiet, the particular stillness that arrives right before you understand your entire evening has to be recalculated from the very beginning. Because I remembered that dance. I remembered every single detail of it, actually, having watched it happen from 6 feet away, smiling the entire time, because I had genuinely believed, until exactly this moment, that it had meant nothing at all. My name is Caroline Whitfield, though I'd been Caroline Whitfield for exactly 11 hours when I read that text, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of the single strangest, most carefully engineered evening of my entire life. The wedding day I spent unknowingly hosting my husband's first love as an honored guest, and the exact moment, less than 12 hours later, that I understood precisely what I'd need to do about it, calmly, completely, and on a stage considerably larger than either of them had ever expected me to have access to. I need to take you back to the beginning of that day, though, because you won't understand exactly how deep this went unless you understand how carefully it had all been arranged around me. I'm 34 years old, and I run marketing operations for a mid-sized hospitality group out of Charleston, South Carolina, a job that's taught me, over 11 years, how to notice exactly which details in a room have been carefully staged and which ones simply happened by accident. Weddings, in particular, are events I understand at a level most people never have to. I've coordinated corporate galas for a living, walked hundreds of event floor plans, learned to read a seating chart the way other people read a novel, understanding instantly who's being elevated, who's being managed, and who's being quietly, deliberately kept at a careful distance from someone else. I tell you this because it matters enormously to what happened at my own wedding, because the version of myself standing in that reception hall that evening should have caught every single signal I later understood had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. I didn't. Because on your own wedding day, apparently, even the sharpest professional instincts you've spent a decade building can simply go quiet, replaced entirely by the desperate, understandable wish to just be happy for one single afternoon without analyzing anything at all. Daniel and I had been together for 4 years before that wedding, engaged for 14 months, and I want to be honest that I had heard Vanessa Cole's name exactly twice in all that time, both times delivered with the same careful, practiced casualness that I now understand, in hindsight, should have registered as considerably more significant than it did. The first time was early in our relationship, maybe 6 months in, when Daniel mentioned, almost as an aside while we were driving somewhere, that he'd dated someone seriously in his mid-20s, someone named Vanessa, before things just didn't work out, mostly because of timing. I remember asking a few gentle follow-up questions, the way you do early in a relationship when you're still cataloging someone's history, and Daniel had given me just enough detail to seem forthcoming without ever actually telling me anything specific. She'd moved for a job, he said, and by the time she came back to town, he'd already met me, and it simply never made sense to revisit anything with her once we were serious. I remember finding that explanation completely reasonable at the time, even slightly romantic in a low-key way, the story of a man who'd simply moved on with his life once the right relationship found him. The second time her name came up was almost 2 years later, at a work function where a mutual friend mentioned, in passing, that Vanessa was doing well in her new position at a firm downtown, and I watched Daniel's face for exactly half a second longer than felt entirely comfortable before he changed the subject smoothly, gracefully, in a way that felt, at the time, like simple politeness rather than anything worth examining. I filed both conversations away without a second thought. I had absolutely no reason, at that point in our relationship, to imagine either conversation mattered even slightly to the wedding we would eventually plan together. The invitation list itself, when Daniel and I built it together roughly 8 months before the wedding, felt entirely ordinary, the way these things usually do, a combination of his family, my family, close friends from both our lives, a handful of work colleagues we felt obligated to include, and a modest scattering of what I'd call history guests. People from earlier chapters of our respective lives who felt appropriate to invite even though we weren't especially close anymore. Daniel had suggested, casually, while we sat at our kitchen table with our laptops open one evening, that we include a woman named Vanessa Cole, explaining that she'd reconnected with several of his old college friends over the years and it would honestly feel strange, socially, to invite that entire friend group while deliberately excluding her, given how tightly interwoven everyone still was. I remember shrugging, genuinely unbothered, adding her name to the spreadsheet without a second thought, because I trusted the story Daniel had given me completely, and because I had no reason yet to understand that reconnected with old college friends was, in this particular case, doing an enormous amount of quiet, careful work to obscure something considerably more significant than a casual friend group overlap. I should mention here, because it matters enormously to everything that happened later, that I come from a family with what people politely call significant means, though I've spent most of my adult life deliberately underselling that fact in nearly every context outside my own family gatherings. My mother's side of the family controls a substantial hospitality investment group, one that owns a meaningful stake in several boutique hotel chains along the East Coast, including, as it happens, the very venue where Daniel and I got married, a decision I'd made deliberately, wanting our wedding to feel personal rather than performative. Choosing a property my grandmother had actually built from a single failing motel decades earlier rather than some anonymous luxury venue we had no real connection to. Daniel knew, in a general sense, that my family had money. He did not know, and I had never particularly felt the need to specify, exactly how much operational control I personally held within that same company, having spent the last 6 years quietly building out an executive role in marketing and guest experience that most people at industry events simply assumed was a nice, respectable job rather than a position that came with genuine authority over how our properties presented themselves to the public. I mention this now, at the beginning of the story, because it's going to matter considerably more by the end of it than it seemed to matter. On the morning of my own wedding, when I was simply focused on whether the florist had remembered the specific shade of blush peonies I'd spent 3 appointments selecting. The morning of the wedding itself unfolded exactly the way you'd hope a wedding morning would unfold. My mother and my sister in the bridal suite with me, champagne we barely touched, a hairstylist working carefully through the elaborate updo I'd been planning since I was maybe 12 years old, watching wedding videos of other people's weddings and privately deciding, even then, exactly how I wanted my own hair to look someday. I remember feeling almost unbearably happy that morning, the specific, uncomplicated happiness that exists before you understand anything is wrong, the kind that makes you generous and unguarded in a way you rarely allow yourself to be during ordinary days. I remember my mother adjusting my veil at one point and telling me, quietly, that she'd never seen me this settled, this certain about anything, in my entire life, and I remember believing her completely, because I felt exactly that certain myself, standing in front of that mirror in a dress I'd chosen specifically because it made me feel, for the first time in years, like I wasn't performing any version of myself at all. The ceremony itself took place in the venue's restored chapel, a small stone building my grandmother had insisted on preserving during the original renovation decades earlier, and I remember almost none of the specific words exchanged, the way most people describe their own ceremonies afterward, remembering instead only fragments, the particular quality of afternoon light coming through the stained glass, my father's hand trembling slightly as he walked me down the aisle, Daniel's face when he first saw me, an expression that still, even now, even knowing everything I know now, I believe was completely genuine in that specific moment. I want to be fair about that, actually, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. Whatever else Daniel did that day, whatever he'd been quietly managing behind the scenes for months, I don't believe the emotion on his face during our actual ceremony was staged. I believe, and I've had considerable time to sit with this conclusion since, that Daniel was fully capable of loving me completely while simultaneously, carefully, protecting an entirely separate emotional obligation he'd never once been honest with me about, and that these two things, uncomfortable as they are to hold together, were both, somehow, equally true. The reception began around 6, held in the venue's main ballroom, a space with soaring windows overlooking the harbor that I'd specifically chosen because the evening light coming through them during golden hour was, quite simply, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in any event space I'd toured professionally. Roughly 180 guests moved through cocktail hour with the particular warm, unhurried energy of people who genuinely like each other, and I remember moving through that crowd on Daniel's arm, greeting people, accepting an almost overwhelming number of compliments about the venue, the flowers, the dress, feeling entirely, completely present in a way I rarely allow myself to feel during events I'm professionally responsible for managing. This was the one event, I remember thinking specifically, that I got to simply experience rather than orchestrate. I met Vanessa Cole for the first time at approximately 7:15, during the extended cocktail hour, when Daniel's college roommate, a genuinely warm man named Tobias who'd flown in from Seattle for the wedding, introduced us near the bar with the kind of easy, unbothered casualness that told me, immediately and correctly, that Tobias himself had absolutely no idea he was introducing me to anyone significant. "Caroline, this is Vanessa, she was part of our whole college crew back in the day," he said, and I extended my hand, smiling, genuinely delighted in the specific, uncomplicated way you're delighted by literally everyone at your own wedding, because on that particular evening, every single person in that room felt, to me, like part of an enormous, warm, celebratory blur. Vanessa was striking in a way that registered immediately and specifically, though I want to be clear that in that moment, it registered simply as an aesthetic observation rather than anything approaching suspicion. Tall, composed, dressed in a deep emerald cocktail dress that stood out elegantly against the room's softer, more pastel palette, with the particular quality of stillness some people carry that makes a room organize itself slightly around them without them appearing to try. "It's so lovely to finally meet you," she said, holding my hand a beat longer than felt entirely ordinary, though I registered that detail, in the moment, as simply warmth rather than anything worth examining further. "Daniel talks about you constantly. I've been genuinely looking forward to this." I thanked her, said something appropriately gracious about being glad she could make it, and moved on to the next cluster of guests waiting to congratulate us, filing that entire interaction away as nothing more significant than one warm conversation among roughly 180 similar conversations happening across that room that same evening. Dinner unfolded beautifully, speeches landed exactly the way you hope wedding speeches will land. My father cried during his toast in a way that made the entire room laugh and then quietly tear up simultaneously, and by the time the DJ announced it was time for our first dance as husband and wife, I remember feeling that specific, floating happiness that exists at the exact peak of an enormous celebration, before exhaustion sets in, before anything at all has gone even slightly wrong. Daniel and I danced our first dance to a song we'd chosen together months earlier, and I remember very specifically catching his eye at one point during that dance and thinking, with total, uncomplicated certainty, that I had never once in my entire life felt this exactly right about a single decision. The moment that would eventually detonate everything happened roughly 40 minutes later, during what the DJ had labeled, on our carefully planned reception timeline, as open dancing, the period after the formal father-daughter and mother-son dances where guests are simply invited onto the floor freely. I was sitting at our sweetheart table, catching my breath, chatting with my sister, when I noticed Daniel had stepped away from the head table and was standing near the edge of the dance floor with Vanessa, the two of them appearing to have a brief, quiet exchange before the DJ, apparently at Daniel's private request just moments earlier, transitioned smoothly into a slower song. I watched, from roughly 30 feet away, as Daniel extended his hand to her, and as she took it, and as the two of them moved onto the dance floor together for what I genuinely understood, in that specific moment, watching it happen, to be nothing more than one polite, obligatory dance between a groom and an old friend from his college years. The kind of moment that happens at literally hundreds of weddings without carrying any particular significance at all. I remember smiling as I watched them, actually, thinking it was sweet that Daniel wanted to include an old friend in the celebration this way, thinking nothing further about it whatsoever, because I had absolutely no context yet, sitting at that table in my wedding dress, to understand that this specific dance had been quietly negotiated, planned, and anticipated by both people currently moving across that floor for reasons that had nothing to do with simple old friendship at all. They danced for perhaps 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes at most, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have registered as inappropriate to a single other person in that room, and then the song shifted back into something more upbeat, and Daniel returned to our table, kissed my cheek, and asked if I wanted anything from the bar, and I said yes, and that was, as far as I understood at the time, the complete and total significance of that entire interaction. I did not think about it again for the remaining 4 hours of the reception. I did not think about it during our exit, sparklers held aloft by roughly 60 guests as we ran laughing toward the waiting car. I did not think about it during the quiet, exhausted, deeply happy ride to our hotel suite, where Daniel and I sat together on the edge of the bed for nearly an hour, still in our wedding clothes, simply talking through the best moments of the entire day, both of us too wired with adrenaline and joy to sleep. I did not think about that dance again until 11:47 that night, lying awake beside my sleeping husband, when his phone buzzed once on the nightstand between us, and some reflexive, entirely ordinary instinct made me glance at the screen before I could stop myself, and I saw Vanessa Cole's name attached to a message preview that read, in its entirety, before the screen went dark again, "That dance meant more than you'll ever admit to her. I'm glad I came." I lay completely still for a long time after reading that sentence, feeling my own heartbeat in my ears, running through every possible innocent explanation my mind could construct, the way you do when you desperately want a piece of information to mean less than it obviously means. Maybe it was a joke between old friends, referencing some private history that had nothing to do with romantic significance at all. Maybe Vanessa was simply being dramatic, the way some people are dramatic about entirely ordinary moments, exaggerating a friendly dance into something poetic because that's simply her personality. I turned each explanation over carefully, methodically, the way I'd trained myself to evaluate any piece of incomplete information at work, and found that none of them actually held together once I set them against the specific, deliberate wording of that message. Meant more than you'll ever admit to her. Not to me. Not to anyone. Specifically, deliberately, to her, meaning me, meaning that Vanessa understood, with total clarity, that whatever had actually happened during those 90 seconds on the dance floor carried a significance Daniel had no intention of ever disclosing to his own wife. I didn't wake Daniel that night. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters to everything that happened over the following weeks. It wasn't calculation yet, not really. It was simple, overwhelming exhaustion, combined with a very specific, protective instinct I didn't fully understand until much later, the sense that whatever I was about to discover deserved to be approached carefully, deliberately, rather than through an explosive confrontation at midnight on my own wedding night, still wearing my wedding dress, still smelling faintly of the specific gardenia perfume I'd worn for the ceremony. I lay awake instead, running through every detail of that day with an entirely new lens, feeling the specific, sick sensation of watching an ordinary memory rearrange itself in real time into something considerably more complicated than I'd understood while I was living through it. I thought about Vanessa's hand lingering a beat too long during our introduction. I thought about the particular quality of stillness she'd carried, the way the room had seemed to organize itself around her without her appearing to try. I thought about Daniel's face during the 2 previous conversations about her, the half-second of held expression before he'd smoothly changed the subject at that work function years earlier. Piece by piece, lying in the dark beside my sleeping husband on the first night of our marriage, I began constructing a timeline I had absolutely no intention of confronting anyone with until I understood its complete shape. I called my sister, Margot, the next morning while Daniel was in the shower, keeping my voice low, explaining everything as quickly and clearly as I could manage. Margot, to her enormous credit, didn't tell me I was overreacting, didn't suggest I was reading too much into an innocent text message the way a less careful friend might have. "That's not an ambiguous sentence, Caroline," she said quietly. "That's someone confirming something happened that you weren't supposed to fully understand." I sat with that assessment for the rest of our honeymoon, 5 days in the Amalfi Coast that I want to be honest were genuinely, complicatedly wonderful in most respects. Daniel was attentive, warm, entirely present in every ordinary way a new husband should be, and I found myself, more than once during that trip, wondering whether I was building an entire narrative out of a single overly dramatic text message from a woman who simply had a flair for excessive language. But every time I nearly talked myself into that more comfortable explanation, I returned to the specific, deliberate wording of that sentence, and I understood, with a clarity that felt increasingly undeniable the longer I sat with it, that I was not going to fully move forward into this marriage until I understood exactly what that dance had actually meant, and exactly how far back its significance actually extended. I began gathering information carefully once we returned from our honeymoon, using the same methodical, patient approach I'd bring to any complicated professional situation, understanding instinctively that whatever I eventually confronted Daniel with needed to be complete, undeniable, and impossible to explain away with the kind of smooth, half-true deflection I now recognized, looking back, he'd used at least twice already regarding this exact subject. I didn't go through his phone directly. That felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross yet, and more practically, I understood he'd simply delete anything incriminating the moment he suspected I was looking. Instead, I did something considerably more useful. Drawing on instincts I'd built over a decade of professional event planning, I quietly, carefully reconstructed the guest list decision-making process, going back through our wedding planning emails, our shared spreadsheet edit history, the specific conversation, which I now remembered in far more detail than I'd initially registered, where Daniel had suggested including Vanessa in the first place. What I found, once I actually looked closely, was considerably more damning than a single ambiguous text message. Daniel had not simply suggested including Vanessa on our guest list, the way he'd originally described it to me. Checking the spreadsheet's edit history, a feature I'd forgotten even existed until I went looking for it specifically, I discovered that Daniel had added Vanessa's name to our master list nearly 3 weeks before we'd had our supposed casual kitchen table conversation about including her, meaning the conversation where he'd framed her inclusion as a casual, almost reluctant social obligation had actually been staged around a decision he'd already made privately, weeks earlier, for reasons he had clearly never intended to share with me honestly. I sat with that discovery for a long time, feeling something harden in my chest that hadn't fully solidified until that exact moment. This wasn't an old friend who happened to overlap with a shared friend group. This was someone Daniel had specifically, deliberately wanted present at our wedding, badly enough to plan her inclusion weeks in advance and then construct a casual cover story to explain her presence to me without ever revealing his actual motivation. I reached out to Tobias next, Daniel's college roommate who'd introduced us that evening, calling him under the pretense of thanking him properly for flying in and steering our conversation, carefully and gradually, toward Vanessa. Tobias, it turned out, had absolutely no reason to guard anything on Daniel's behalf, having no idea any of this carried any significance at all, and he told me, with the easy, unguarded honesty of someone who assumed he was simply reminiscing pleasantly, that Vanessa and Daniel had actually dated for almost 2 years, not the brief, vague, mid-20s thing Daniel had described to me, and that their relationship had ended not because Vanessa moved away for a job, the story I'd been given originally, but because Daniel himself had ended things, abruptly, right around the time he'd started seriously dating someone else, someone Tobias, thinking back, believed might have actually been me, or someone shortly before me. He wasn't entirely certain of the exact timeline. Honestly, we all thought he made a mistake, Tobias said, entirely without malice, simply reminiscing the way old friends do. Vanessa was great. But you know how these things go, timing's everything, I guess, and clearly it worked out how it was supposed to, since you two are perfect together. I thanked him warmly, told him I was thrilled he'd made the trip, and hung up the phone feeling something considerably colder settle into my chest than warmth. The timeline Tobias had unknowingly handed me meant that Daniel's relationship with Vanessa had likely overlapped, at least briefly, with the very beginning of our own relationship, meaning the story he'd told me, about a clean, uncomplicated breakup that predated me entirely, was not simply incomplete. It was actively, deliberately false, constructed specifically to prevent me from ever asking the more uncomfortable questions that a more accurate timeline would have naturally invited. I spent the following week in a strange, controlled state I can only describe as professionally calm, moving through my actual job with total competence while privately, methodically continuing to build out a picture I understood, with increasing certainty, I was going to eventually need to present to Daniel directly, complete and undeniable, exactly the way I'd learned to present any complicated situation at work, not with accusation, but with documentation so thorough it left no room for deflection. I confronted Daniel on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after our wedding, having spent that entire time deciding exactly how I wanted this conversation to unfold, understanding, with a clarity I'd earned through considerable professional experience, that the way you open a difficult conversation almost entirely determines whether you get an honest answer or a carefully managed one. I didn't lead with the text message. I led with a single question, delivered calmly, while we sat together at our kitchen table on an entirely ordinary evening. How long did you and Vanessa actually date? I watched something shift immediately across his face, the particular shift of someone realizing, in real time, that the story they've been carefully managing has just been directly, specifically challenged rather than left comfortably unexamined. A while, he said carefully, testing the boundaries of how much vagueness I'd still accept. 2 years, Daniel, I said, keeping my voice level. Not the brief thing you told me about. And you added her to our wedding guest list 3 weeks before you ever mentioned her to me at all. I watched him understand, in that exact moment, that whatever careful management he'd been doing for the better part of 4 years had just, entirely, run out of room to continue. Over the following 2 hours, Daniel told me a version of the truth that landed considerably worse than the lie it replaced, though I want to be fair and acknowledge he did eventually tell me the complete version once he understood deflection was no longer an option. He and Vanessa had dated seriously for nearly 2 years in his mid-20s, a relationship he described, with what I believe was genuine, if belated, honesty, as the most significant relationship of his life before me. They'd broken up not because of distance or timing, but because Vanessa had wanted to move for a major career opportunity and Daniel, at that specific point in his life, hadn't been ready to either follow her or ask her to stay, a decision he'd apparently regretted, in some quiet, ongoing way, for years afterward. He'd started seeing me roughly 8 months after that breakup, and had genuinely, sincerely fallen in love with me over the following years, a claim I believe, even now, even knowing everything else. But somewhere in the process of planning our wedding, an old, unresolved thread had apparently pulled at him hard enough that he'd reached out to Vanessa privately, initially just to reconnect, and had eventually, without ever telling me, invited her to our wedding specifically because some part of him wanted the chance to dance with her one final time, to close a chapter he'd apparently never fully closed, before formally beginning an entirely new one with me. I love you, he said, more than once during that conversation, and I want to be honest that I believe he meant it, even as I sat there understanding, with total clarity, that loving me had apparently never once prevented him from simultaneously, secretly managing an entirely separate emotional obligation he'd deliberately hidden from me for the entire duration of our engagement. But you invited her to our wedding to get closure with someone else, I said quietly, and you built an entire false story to make sure I never asked the questions that would have revealed that to me. He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that would have survived the specific, undeniable timeline I'd already assembled that I want to tell you honestly that I did not immediately end my marriage that evening, sitting at our kitchen table 3 weeks after our wedding, because the situation, however painful, was genuinely more complicated than a simple, clean betrayal narrative might suggest. Daniel had not been unfaithful to me during our marriage. He had, instead, carried an unresolved emotional thread into our wedding day, deliberately concealed it from me, and orchestrated an entire evening around giving himself closure with someone else, without ever once considering that I might deserve the choice of whether that closure happened at my own wedding at all. I spent the following week in a strange, suspended state, working through what this actually meant for a marriage that was, in every other respect, only 3 weeks old, talking through it extensively with Margot, with a therapist I began seeing almost immediately, trying to determine whether this was a survivable breach of trust or a fundamental indication of exactly how much Daniel was willing to hide from me when he decided, unilaterally, that honesty would simply be too complicated. What ultimately clarified my thinking, more than anything else, was a second conversation I had, deliberately this time, with Vanessa herself, roughly 10 days after confronting Daniel. I reached out to her directly, calmly, explaining that I understood the full history now and simply wanted to hear her perspective, an approach that surprised her enough that she agreed to meet me for coffee the following afternoon. She arrived looking considerably more uncertain than the composed, striking woman I'd met at my own wedding, and she told me, with what felt like genuine, if belated, remorse, that Daniel had reached out to her nearly 4 months before our wedding, initially just to see how she was doing, and that the conversation had gradually evolved, over several subsequent calls, into something considerably more emotionally loaded than either of them had initially intended. He told me he needed to see me one more time before he got married, she said quietly, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. He said he needed to know if what we had was really over, or if he was making a mistake marrying someone else while still wondering. I should have said no. I know that. But I'd wondered the same thing for years, and some part of me needed to know too. I asked her the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since that first text message. Did that dance answer the question for either of you? She was quiet for a long moment before answering honestly. For me, yes, she said. I think somewhere in those 90 seconds, we both finally understood it was actually over, completely, for the first time in years. I think that's what my text meant, if I'm honest. Not that anything is still happening between us. That something finally, completely ended, right there on your wedding day, in a way it apparently needed you to unknowingly host in order for either of us to fully accept it. I sat with that explanation for a long time after Vanessa left that coffee shop, understanding that it was, in its own strange way, probably the most honest and complete answer I was ever going to receive about what had actually happened. It didn't excuse what Daniel had done. It didn't erase the fact that he'd built a deliberate, sustained deception around securing that closure, denying me any say in whether my own wedding day should double as the venue for his emotional resolution with someone else. But it did clarify, with a specificity I hadn't had access to before that conversation, exactly what I was actually dealing with, not an ongoing threat to my marriage, but a specific, contained deception about a specific, contained need Daniel had never trusted me enough to simply be honest about. I made my decision about how to move forward roughly 2 weeks after that conversation with Vanessa, and I want to be clear that the decision I made was not about whether to stay married to Daniel. That question, I'd already resolved, working through weeks of careful, deliberate consideration with my therapist, deciding that the relationship, while genuinely damaged, was not fundamentally beyond repair, provided Daniel could demonstrate, consistently and over considerable time, that this specific pattern of protective deception would never happen again. The decision I made instead was about how I wanted Daniel to understand, completely and unmistakably, exactly how significant this betrayal of trust had actually been, in a way that would ensure he never again assumed I was someone who simply wouldn't notice, or wouldn't eventually understand, whatever careful management he decided, unilaterally, that our marriage required. I want to explain something about my family's hospitality company before I tell you what I actually did, because it matters enormously to how this story concludes. Every year, our company hosts a significant industry gala, an event I personally oversee as part of my role, honoring the properties and partnerships that have performed most successfully across the previous year. It's a genuinely significant event within our specific industry, drawing several hundred attendees, including major partners, investors, and press coverage that meaningfully influences how our brand gets discussed across the entire sector for the following year. Daniel had attended this gala with me twice before, as my supportive, if somewhat peripheral, +1, understanding it was professionally important to me without ever fully grasping exactly how much operational control I personally held over the evening's proceedings, having always deliberately underplayed that specific detail, the way I generally underplay most things related to my family's business. The gala that year fell almost exactly 10 weeks after our wedding, and I decided, with Daniel's full, if uncertain, agreement, that we would attend together, both of us understanding it as a kind of unofficial marker of where our marriage currently stood, genuinely trying to move forward. But not yet fully healed, still carefully, deliberately rebuilding trust in 100 small, ongoing ways. What Daniel did not fully understand, arriving at that gala in his tuxedo, was that I had spent the preceding several weeks quietly, deliberately restructuring a small but meaningful portion of the evening's program, using authority I genuinely held but had simply never had occasion to fully exercise in front of him before. The specific segment I'd restructured was a brief, informal moment near the end of the evening, traditionally reserved for the company's senior leadership to offer some closing remarks before the final dance portion of the gala began. I informed the event committee, with entirely legitimate professional justification, that I wanted to personally deliver those closing remarks that year, framing them around a theme of transparency and trust within professional partnerships, a theme genuinely relevant to several ongoing initiatives across our properties that I'd actually been developing for months, completely independent of anything happening in my marriage. Nobody questioned this request. I was, after all, the executive who'd been quietly running successful guest experience initiatives across our properties for 6 years, and closing remarks about trust and transparency fit entirely naturally within that professional context. I took the microphone at approximately 10:15 that evening, Daniel seated at our table roughly 20 feet away, watching with the easy, unbothered warmth of a supportive spouse who had absolutely no idea what was actually about to happen. I delivered the first several minutes of genuinely, professionally substantive remarks about partnership integrity within our industry, remarks that would have stood entirely on their own as appropriate closing content for that specific event, drawing on real examples from our property's recent guest experience initiatives. And then, having established that legitimate professional foundation, I shifted, deliberately, into something considerably more personal, watching Daniel's expression change in real time as he understood, gradually and then all at once, exactly where I was actually heading. "I want to close tonight with something a little more personal," I said, my voice steady, calm, carrying easily across a ballroom of several hundred industry colleagues and partners. 10 weeks ago, I got married, in a wedding I planned with enormous care, believing completely in the transparency of the person I was marrying. I watched Daniel go very still at our table. I learned, shortly after that wedding, that transparency isn't something you can simply assume exists in a relationship. It's something you have to actively choose, again and again, especially in the moments that are hardest to be honest about. I paused, letting that land, watching several hundred faces turn slightly, curious now, sensing something more specific unfolding than a generic toast about honesty. I believe, genuinely, in second chances built on complete honesty. I believe people can make mistakes and still deserve the opportunity to rebuild something real. But I also believe those of us in positions of trust, whether that's running a company, planning an event for hundreds of guests, or simply making promises to the person standing across from you at an altar, owe the people who trust us the complete truth, delivered directly, rather than a carefully managed version designed to avoid the harder conversation. I looked, very deliberately, at Daniel, and I watched every single person at nearby tables follow my gaze, understanding, without me needing to say another word, exactly who this specific portion of my remarks was actually addressed to. Here's to choosing honesty, even when it's considerably harder than the alternative. Thank you all for being here tonight. I handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and walked, calmly, back to our table, where Daniel sat, completely pale, understanding, with total clarity, that I had just delivered a message specifically to him, in front of several hundred witnesses from both our professional and social circles, without ever once mentioning his name, without ever once making the reference so explicit that anyone outside our immediate circle would fully understand its specific context, but delivering it with enough pointed clarity that Daniel himself would never, for a single second, be able to mistake its meaning. He didn't say anything until we were in the car afterward, driving home in a silence that had a very particular, weighted quality to it. "That was about me," he finally said, "and it wasn't really a question. That was about us," I told him. "About exactly how much I need you to understand that I will always eventually know the complete truth, Daniel. I have the patience and the resources to find it every single time. I would genuinely rather you simply give it to me directly, the first time, instead of making me build the entire case myself before I can even begin trusting you again. I want to tell you honestly that this moment, standing at that microphone, delivering remarks that would end up being discussed, quietly, for weeks afterward among people who'd been present that evening, was not designed as pure humiliation, though I won't pretend there wasn't some genuine satisfaction in Daniel finally understanding, completely and viscerally, exactly how much authority I actually held in spaces he'd only ever seen me move through peripherally. It was, more than anything, a specific, deliberate demonstration of something I needed him to understand at the deepest possible level before I was willing to continue rebuilding our marriage, that I was not someone who would simply accept carefully managed half-truths indefinitely, that I had both the capability and the willingness to eventually understand the complete shape of anything he tried to hide from me, and that whatever version of our marriage moved forward from that point needed to be built on him understanding that reality completely, rather than continuing to test its boundaries the way he had, quietly, in the months leading up to our wedding. The months that followed that gala were genuinely difficult, in the specific, unglamorous way that actual relationship repair usually is. Extensive couples therapy, difficult conversations that didn't resolve neatly in a single evening, a slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust that had absolutely nothing to do with dramatic gestures and everything to do with hundreds of small, consistent choices over an extended period of time. Daniel, to his credit, did the work, genuinely and consistently, in a way that eventually, gradually, allowed me to believe, with real conviction rather than simple hope, that he had actually internalized the lesson that gala had been specifically designed to teach him. We're 2 years into our marriage now, and I won't tell you it's been a simple, uncomplicated recovery, because that wouldn't be honest, and honesty, as it turns out, is the entire foundation this specific story is actually about. What I will tell you is that Daniel has never again, in 2 years, allowed me to discover something significant through a text message glowing on a nightstand at midnight. When difficult things arise now, and they occasionally do, the way they do in any real marriage, he tells me directly, immediately, understanding completely, at this point, that the alternative simply isn't survivable for us anymore. I think often, still, about that specific dance, those 90 seconds I watched from 30 feet away, smiling, understanding absolutely nothing about their real significance in the moment. I think about how close I came to never fully understanding what actually happened, if that phone hadn't buzzed at exactly 11:47 that specific night, if I'd been asleep instead of lying awake in the strange, wired exhaustion that follows an enormous celebration. I think about the version of myself who might have simply continued forward into that marriage, never fully understanding the complete truth of my own wedding day, and I understand, with real clarity, that whatever version of my marriage exists now, 2 years later, exists specifically because I chose patience and documentation over immediate, explosive confrontation. The exact same instinct that has served me throughout my entire professional life, applied, for the first time, to the most personal situation I've ever had to navigate. That if you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the 2 years since that gala. If you discovered, through something as small and accidental as a phone screen lighting up in the dark, that the person you just married had been quietly managing an entire hidden emotional obligation throughout your entire engagement, would you have confronted them immediately, right there in the dark on your wedding night, or would you have done what I did, waited, gathered the complete truth carefully, methodically, and then found your own specific, deliberate way to make sure they understood exactly how completely you'd eventually come to understand it? I read every single comment on these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your answer tonight, while this is still sitting fresh with you rather than tomorrow, once the details have already started to fade. Tell me exactly where you're watching from, and tell me honestly what you think you would have done in my position, standing at that microphone. And if this story reached something real in you tonight, don't just close this video and move on to whatever comes next in your feed. Hit subscribe right now, because the stories waiting for you here are exactly the kind people tell me, again and again, that they think about for days afterward. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.